The Old Testament reading is from Isaiah chapter 60, beginning with the first verse. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness peoples. But the Lord shall arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall be acceptable on my altar, and I will glorify my glorious house. And then from Hebrew chapter 2, beginning with the 10th verse. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared his same thing, so that death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, and that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he has to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, so he is able to help those who are being tested. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Not too long ago, I was a sophomore in college. I was a cross-country and track athlete at my undergraduate school, and I had one of those summers of training where I came back a lot faster than I had ever been running. But no sooner than I had been seeing major progress in my workouts, I started to get foot pain in my left foot. So I did as any, college athlete would do. I went to our athletic trainers and I told them that my foot had been hurting, and I said, whatever I need to do to be able to make it to the next race, I'll do it. So for me, they decided that it sounded like it was maybe a tendon issue. So I started doing about 40 minutes of tendon rehabilitation every day before I ran. And I did this for almost 3 weeks. The pain wasn't necessarily getting better, but it wasn't getting worse either. So I kept going along with the treatment plan. And I finally got to my next race. And I was about halfway through the race when I could just tell that there was something very wrong with my foot. And so I got to the finish line, and I remember flinging off my racing spike and looking down at my foot and expecting it to be bruised, but it looked fine. And I was like, maybe it's all in my head. This pain maybe isn't real. And so I went on with my Friday, and by the time Sunday rolled around, the next thing on my training plan was to run 8 miles. And so I ran 8 miles, and at this point my foot had been hurting more than it did. And so I started running on the side of my foot because I figured if I could run like this, it didn't hurt as much. So I started doing this, and I did that for 8 miles. And I went to the trainer, and the trainer for my rehabilitation, he asked me, how'd the race go? And I was like, not really that great. My foot was really bothering me, but it looks fine, and I ran 8 miles on it yesterday. And he's finally like, you need to go to see a doctor. So I go to the doctor, and I walk into the office, and she has one of those pain charts on her cabinet that, I don't know if you've seen them, but they have smiley faces on one end and really like in pain faces on the other, and it's a 10-point scale, and 1 to 3 is like, yeah, you're a little uncomfortable, like 4 through 6 is ow, and 7 through 10 is you can't think about anything but this pain. And she gives me a bone break test, so she's, twisting my foot, and I'm giving her 6s, like my foot hurt. And at one point, she presses down on my first metatarsal, and I, through the blackout spots on my eyes, scream 9, because I cannot bear the pain, and I need her to let go of my foot. And the second she lets go, I say, no, it's not a 9, it's a 6. I didn't want to admit how much pain that I was in. And we go to the x-ray, and it turned out I had been running on a broken foot. I was on crutches, like I couldn't even put weight on it after they saw the x-ray. But I had convinced myself that I wasn't in pain. I had convinced myself that if I just ran differently, it wouldn't hurt. And the thing that happened is I caused a lot of other problems by ignoring the wound. When I started running on the side of my foot, it gave me knee pain that didn't get better for about 9 months after that injury. When I was running on a broken bone, I lost a dangerous amount of weight because I was running 50 miles a week and trying to heal a bone. It wasn't healthy. I started having anxiety attacks while I was running because I was internalizing pain that I wasn't acknowledging was real. And I didn't understand any of those things at the time. I thought it was just part of being a college athlete. And looking back, it was so horrible that I had ignored that wound. And it's not something that I think we only do physically. Our text today is about suffering and about the ways in which, what are those wounds that we have? What are those broken bones that maybe we just run a little different so we can't notice that our gait has changed? What are those things that we have wounds that need to be healed, but we're telling the doctor it's only a 6 when it's been a 9 the whole time? This text from Hebrews talks about what it means to be people who know pain, people who have been broken, people who have suffered. It says that we are descendants of Abraham. We are people of flesh and blood. We are vulnerable to the forces of sin and death. And because of that, it is inevitable that we feel pain. This text does not try to hide suffering or pretend that it doesn't exist. It does not blame us for suffering or blame God. It just simply says, yeah, we are people who have suffered. And I don't think this is something we do very well as a culture. When we post on social media about our year, or even when we ask each other, how are you doing? We don't really ever talk about the ways in which we're suffering. And I think our motivations are actually pretty pure for why we do that. I think we tell ourselves things like, well, it's not as bad as how other people have it. Like, I don't want to bring my pain into this space. Like, what if they're dealing with something worse? And so we just make it easier by saying, I'm fine, it doesn't hurt, I'm okay. We believe lies about how our suffering can't be as bad because other people have it worse. We say things like, well, I can't grieve the death of an elderly parent when some people have lost parents at much younger ages. But friends, that's just not true. If it hurts, it hurts. If it's suffering, it's suffering. And it's okay to say that it hurts. We have to be bold in talking about our suffering. We don't have to compare our pain with others or even ourselves. If it hurts, and that's all that matters. We tell ourselves that it can't be a 9. We minimize our suffering, but what we're actually doing is not treating the wound properly. We're not admitting that we have a broken bone. We're not admitting that maybe we need to take some time off. Maybe we need to go to the doctor and heal. And we all have these wounds, and they look different in every single one of us. But we've all suffered, and we've all grieved. And we have to name what those sufferings and wounds and griefs are. We have to admit that we need help. We have to admit we need to heal. We can't just readjust the way we're walking so no one notices that we're in pain. Because when we do this, when we just pretend like it's not happening, we cause other problems. When we ignore a childhood trauma, it causes pain somewhere new. It ripples into our family or impacts the way we love in the future. When we deny our suffering, we only make things worse. And worse than that, we miss an opportunity to be healed. We miss an opportunity to be whole. In our deepest and truest experience of suffering, when we ignore this opportunity for healing, we miss that Jesus is present in our suffering and present to be with us as we heal. We miss that death and sin are conquered and that we have life. One of the things that scientists have found out about suffering, specifically trauma, is that victims of trauma can struggle to narrate what has happened to them. The experience, horrifyingly real in the victim's memory, can be impossible to put language to. In wake of such trauma, the victim can be left without a story to adequately share with their loved ones what happened to them, yet still be surrounded by vivid and powerful and constantly reoccurring memories of one's suffering. So sometimes the first step in addressing our suffering and our pain is to simply share with others that we are suffering. Something bad happened. We are in pain. One community of people who've experienced a unique form of suffering are war veterans. The experience of violence and loss can change our veterans' lives in a way that makes it much harder to come home from war. Veterans coming home from war have experienced healing through a unique form of therapy, though, they've found. This therapy comes in the form of theater. Veterans are performing and participating in theater performances. There is a theater troupe that takes veterans themselves and allows them to reenact dramatic retellings of their own war stories. These artistic and honest retellings do multiple things for the veteran community. On one level, they allow the veterans to tell their stories. They are able to access that really scary memory, the part of their brain that had been altered by trauma and haunts their day to day, is now visited in the safety of community and in the safety of art. Going to the very moment of horror in one's memory first accesses one's fight or flight response, but doing this in the control of a theater troupe in the format of art allows the veterans to go to that memory in a much safer way. This new experience, this safer experience, heals the part of the brain that was altered by the trauma. Additionally, these veterans having been people who've experienced trauma and who may be haunted by trauma, they can feel very isolated. Normal emotions and experiences are now altered by trauma, and one can feel broken because they're not processing and living in the world in the same way that they used to. They might start to believe lies like they can't be in relationship with people who haven't seen what they've seen. They might start to think that their families and their friends are better off without them because they don't want that brokenness in their lives. But this isolation is remedied by these performances because it gives the veterans the ability to share their story. Their friends and family are able to see, look what happened to me, but they're able to do it in a way that's safe and redemptive. This theater project proved that as veterans performed and shared their stories, the parts of their brain that these memories triggered, the parts that led to these heightened responses, they were accessed in a way where these people finally had control over these memories. They were choosing to go back to the flashback, and they were doing it with others. They were doing it in safety. These memories that previously made them feel lonely and afraid are visited in safety and community. They found that the act of sharing had started to heal the brain. They were healing trauma. The lives of these veterans are beautiful testimonies, ones that involved a lot of professional guidance and therapy, but I think the essence of the story is that it matters for us to expose our wounds together. It matters for us to tell our stories. And the hope in all of this is that we are not permanently broken. We can heal from our suffering. And our Hebrew text today reminds us that Jesus himself meets us in our suffering. Our text today reminds us that in our flesh and blood, in our mortality, our vulnerability to pain and suffering, that is where Jesus meets us. We just celebrated Jesus' birth into this world, and we are reminding that God came as a little baby who experiences the human feelings of hunger, illness, exhaustion, pain, sadness. Yet we have a Savior, a King born to us, but continues to challenge our expectations of kingship. Kings are supposed to grow up in castles, to live comfortable lives away, but Jesus never did that. Jesus was always around those who suffered. Jesus found and sought after and stayed with those who suffered. He finds those who are hungry and feeds them. He stops the crowd to hear the story of a woman whose whole life had been battled by chronic illness. And he says, "Tell me your story." He changes course to raise a dead girl from the dead, and he stops and weeps at the death of his friend. Sometimes the best news in this is that Jesus is present in our suffering. Jesus is weeping with us when our loved one dies. Jesus stops and listens to our story. Jesus wants to hear the stories of our trauma. And Jesus wants to remind us that we are not alone in our suffering. That is why he came to this earth. Jesus goes towards suffering, but also takes it on himself to witness that life overcomes death for all people. Jesus suffers and dies, and we know that Jesus answers our grief with a joyful re-entry to the garden. Jesus reunites with those who love him, and Jesus proves that there is life after death. And we are called to combat suffering as a church, to be together, to hear each other's stories. Jesus calls us to heal, and feed each other. We are given the task to continue to combat suffering with life, to combat isolation with community, to combat pain with healing. So, as we sit in between a decade and the start of a new year, I think it is right for us to contemplate what it means to be people who suffer, but also people who have hope in healing. We can have our typical New Year's resolutions, but I want us to challenge ourselves to think about what it means for our New Year's resolution to be to reveal our wounds, to reveal the stuff that hurts the most, and mostly to believe that a fully resurrected Christ heals those wounds. Undergo that healing process with your church. We have a God who heals our deepest wounds, but this requires honesty, relationship, and time. And church, I hope this is something we can do together. As Ian mentioned, in mid-January, we will be launching a small group rollout. We have been prayerfully considering what is it that this church needs? What is it that heals our wounds? And we have found that we think it's relationships. And so we're hopeful that people can build those relationships, to spend time together, to talk about our stories, to talk about our wounds, and to be in a space of healing together. Let our New Year's resolution be to truth tell, to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with our church family. Let our New Year's resolutions be to be vulnerable. And some of you may have already done this work. This may be a decade of you telling the stories of healing, the stories of redemption, the stories of when you didn't think you'd make it, but you did. And share those here too. Let people know that there is an end to the suffering they're feeling right now. We hope that you will share those stories too. And as the church goes forward, we're going to continue to talk about beauty. And beauty and suffering do go together. Brene Brown has a quote that I really loved. She said, "I think we lose sight of the beauty. The most beautiful things I look back on in my life are coming out from underneath things I didn't know I could get out from underneath. You know, the moments I look back in my life and think, those were the moments that made me, were the moments of struggle." So as we see people post about their New Year's or hear at the parties what everybody's talking about how their 2019 was, we can celebrate those things. We can celebrate the promotions, the growth in family, the moves, the new jobs. But let's also think about New Year's differently. Let us be a church that searches for beauty in new ways. Let us tell the stories of those beautiful moments, the moments we didn't think we could get from underneath, the moments that made us. Let us celebrate our resilience, the nights we chose to stay alive, the addictions we sought help for, the toxic relationships we left, the medication we started taking, the therapist we met with, the marriage counseling we sought, the forgiveness we offered, and the apologies we made. This has been a decade of life. Life continues to include suffering, and we will continue to be resilient people. We are not alone. We have each other, and we have God. God has been with us in our suffering. God has been with us in our sadness. God is with us in our anger, and God is with us in our desperation. God suffered with us and for us because of God's love for us. God does not desire our suffering and draws us towards life after death. 2020 will undoubtedly be a year of trials, but let it be a year that we do not let suffering convince us that we are alone or unloved. May we live as people who believe in a fully resurrected Christ, who heals even our deepest wounds. Glory be to God. Amen.